A timeline is a look back in history, and we use a timeline because we can't really understand what's going on in terms of development in our communities and how to be involved, how to make an impact, unless we also have an understanding of what happened earlier, what happened before in our history.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Lynn's history, and then a little bit about how some of the national events, which is the exercise you're going to be a part of, are reflected in the struggles of working class people in Lynn in responding to the national type of issues that Steve talked about. Lynn's history is a history, first of all, I got to say, I only lived in Lynn about 11 years, and I think Lynn is the best place to live in the entire world. And that's not a common understanding, probably, but that's how I feel. And I'll tell you why. Lynn's history is a history of labor, it's a history of immigration, and it's a history of working class social movements across racial lines. And it's almost unparalleled to anything I've seen anywhere in the United States. So when you say it's a history of labor, I mean, in 1860 was the Great Shoe Strike. It was the biggest labor movement of that up until that point. 20,000 workers went on strike. It was centered in Lynn. 4,000 of them were women, which was very unusual as women began to work in the factories and the textiles and the shoe industries. From that to the GE workers, which impacted the city and the GE union for now 7, 8 decades. It organized first as an independent union in 1933, which still exists. To the personal care attendants, who were organized just a couple of years ago. There were 346 personal care attendants in Lynn who are now members of SEIU 1199. It's a story of immigrants from all the way back from the native people who were pushed off, like the Saugus is a term we still carry from the native history by British and other people that came from Europe, to the Irish who joined other Europeans and came in the 1840s all the way throughout that century and still come today, to the Italians who first defeated the Irish for mayor of Lynn. I think it was in 1964 as Caggiano. Yeah, see, I'll tell you, anybody that's old Italian, we know when we beat the Irish. You go to the Italian club in Lynn, Ward 6, everybody remembers that day. To the Dominicans, who first outnumbered Puerto Ricans in Lynn in the 1990 census. It was the first city in the state of Massachusetts where the Dominicans actually became the largest Latino immigrant group. To the Guatemalans, who fled civil war and giant mega projects in Guatemala, which displaced people off the land, so that there are now probably 7,000 Guatemalans in Lynn. And to the Iraqis, who have come here just as recently as a few weeks ago and continue to come, all looking for a decent life, all bringing histories of struggle and strengths, into this city and to its people. It's a history of multiracial alliances. One of the things that I really found about Lynn that was so exciting, people like Frederick Douglass, he was the great abolitionist. Abolitionism was an effort to end slavery, which is a long and brutal and ultimately bloody struggle in this country. He was an escaped slave, incredibly articulate, brilliant, and he lived in Lynn. His wife was a shoe worker, and he wrote his first autobiography here. He described Lynn as like a cauldron of a sense of justice and equality, and that's why he lived in Lynn for the time he did. It was one of his bases throughout his life. The first African-American city councilor elected in Lynn, it wasn't Buzzy Barton, who just got elected. It wasn't even Matt Wills, for people who may remember, who was elected in the 80s. The first African-American city councilman was elected in the 1880s, and largely by shoe workers. This last week, we saw one other story from way back. Alonzo Draper, who was the leader of that shoe strike that I mentioned in 1860, he was also an abolitionist, white guy, came from Vermont, went to school in Boston, and then moved here to marry a shoe worker and became the leader of the strike I mentioned. He was also a fierce abolitionist. So his union newspaper was full of stories about John Brown, fighting slavery, in Kansas, for example. And he ultimately himself, when the Civil War broke out, he organized a whole group of union workers and other people in Lynn to join as a group in the Civil War to fight slavery. They called it the Lynn Mechanics Phalanx. And he became an officer. He wanted to arm the slaves. And a lot of people didn't want to do that. It's one thing to end slavery. We don't want to give them guns. He ultimately commanded African troops, African-American troops in the Civil War, because there were not allowed to be any black officers. So that's the kind of history that we have. And even just this last week, I think what we saw, the Lynn vote, was such a big deal and changed the whole 6th district. And what it was, if you look at it, it was an alliance between union people who worked out of this building, knocked on 45,000 doors all over the 6th district, and people in the communities of immigrants and communities of color in Lynn who turned out and voted in wards 5, 1, 2, 3, 6, 2, 6, 3, in numbers that were unheard of. And that to say just couldn't believe it. It was that alliance that actually won this election, just this week. So, and I will say one other thing, because I want to mention women throughout all this. The first political meeting where men and women participated together under the same roof was in Lynn, in the United States history. And it was not considered proper for women to be involved. It was not true womanhood. So if women had political meetings, it wasn't a good thing. They certainly couldn't do it with men. You don't know what would happen to get in the room with men. So there was a church, Methodist church on the Commons, where a woman named Abby Kelly brought in a speaker, one of the Grimke sisters, and this was such a powerful speaker, and the men wanted to hear. So first they let him sit in the balcony, and finally so many wanted to get in that they just integrated the meeting. That was called promiscuous meeting at the time. And so that barrier was broken in Lynn. Abby Kelly eventually was the first woman elected to the National Anti-Slavery Society. And she blamed, her opponents blamed the shoe workers in Lynn who got her elected. So all that's history, but it lives with us today. Abby Kelly lived 2 blocks up the street and was a Quaker. The Quaker meeting house right by the Quaker graveyard right up the street. Alonzo Draper, when he led the shoe strike, was at 4 Exchange Street right beside where the Item building is right now. If you talk to the workers who marched in that strike, marched down Exchange and Broad, which is the same street that the immigrant workers' rights marched on, I think it was 2009. The exact same streets, 100 years later. So, and if you scratch a GE worker, an older GE worker, you'll find a shoe worker in their history. That's the tradition that still carries with us today. Now, bringing us up to date a little bit, we'll talk about the national narrative that Steve referred to. Because what you find is that all these struggles in Lynn, which I find so inspiring, I can talk you to death about it, and my friends will tell you I won't do that. A lot of it was based on response to national economic developments or national policy. So all these struggles had a context. So the shoe workers that I mentioned, they were marching and organizing as a response to the first wave of industrialization. And when the big factories and wealth started to be concentrated and they didn't believe in that and they organized in their own interest. The GE workers organized first in 1933. That was a part of a great wave of organizing that came out of the Great Depression. And it was partly because of the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed workers to organize. The author, by the way, the chief author in the House was Congressman Connery, who was from Lynn. He was the chief sponsor. You know the Connery Post 6 on the Commons that was named after him. Personal care attendants organized because the shift was happening from manufacturing workers to service workers. That group of people started to organize. And in the neighborhoods, which I think is probably what we'll talk a lot about today, the brickyard. People know what the brickyard was? No. Anybody? No. Well, it's a neighborhood that's gone now, for the most part. If you pass under the bridge over by Lynn Tech, there's a sign that says brickyard. That was a multiracial neighborhood in Ward 6 that was destroyed by urban renewal. And because they were going to try to put a highway through there. And it's gone. It's a vibrant, great neighborhood. Supposed to be a highway built through there, but it never was because people opposed it. The emphasis on automobiles and highways after World War II and new home construction, it emptied out the central cities all over the country. That's when Ward 1 got built and all the housing, and people moved out to the suburbs. And ultimately, that also emptied out the downtown businesses. so that when the malls were built, North Shore Mall, it just sucked the life out of downtown Lynn. It was a long effort. And all that was a result of highway policy, transportation policy, and housing policy. So that, for example, when we had 9 movie theaters in Lynn, how many movie theaters in Lynn now? 0. And that's because of all those housing and transportation policies and how it changed Lynn and how people responded to that. And then finally, economic and immigration policy means that, for example, and you'll see this on the charts up there in the subprime mortgage, that banks sold people phony mortgages in the recent period that people knew they couldn't pay and ended up expelling them from the houses, which destroyed neighborhoods all over Lynn. And Lynn now has one of the highest, and you'll see these in the charts later on, highest rates of foreclosures of anywhere in the state of Massachusetts. And also, these economic policies now and political struggles meant that folks who have power have decided we no longer can afford Social Security, we no longer can afford Medicare, can afford Medicaid. And that, again, has led to a response from Lynn as recently as this week, as people marched yesterday downtown to try to defend and say we don't want to lose these things when the tax policies are fought out in Congress in the next few weeks. So the national policies are the things that we have to respond to in our organizing. And each of those history of organizing and social movements in Lynn, the unions, the immigrant movement, the multiracial movements, are responding to large national policy issues that impact our lives. So that's what we're going to talk about now, and each of us think of our own lives and how we fit into all this.